Melissa's group here. You've been talking about these topics for a while. What do you guys think? What's your take on that? Is there such a thing?
Everybody quiet.
Everybody's quiet.
We're getting a couple yeses.
Oh, we're getting,
Okay,
yes,
so
we're chatting.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you've seen some in the chat where there's some yeses. Okay.
Yes, slavery
All right.
is based on race.
Okay, and so somebody saying, yeah, that would obviously be maybe an example of institutionalized racism for slavery. At least how it was, at least the kind of slavery that was the chattel slavery that really started in the 1500s, 1600s, and kind of took over the West for sure. There's other forms of slavery that would be race, but so look at my definitions that we'll kind of work through, and we'll just kind of use operating for this talk tonight. So I'm going to say racism is the dehumanization of one group alongside the elevation of another group on external, or in science they use the word phenotypical characteristics, i.e. skin color, shape of your head, skull shape, ears or lips or mouth or nose, all those kind of things. Any of those external characteristics, right? It's this willingness to dehumanize. Somebody is less than, somebody is not fully, worth something that another group has greater worth, right? So that's essentially what I think racism historically has been. Now, we talked about institutional racism, and I would say, yes, it does exist. And for anyone who maybe doubts, I'll give you some examples in this. I will talk about what I think is some examples of that. Institutional racism occurs when racism, like we just defined, is embraced in the dominant culture and used to justify biased actions, unjust laws, or bigoted regulations. So anytime you get these racist attitudes, and then you say, okay, well, let's make that a part of any kind of system or structure, regulation, law, whatever it is. Anything. It could be science. It could be, could have institutionalism. It could be zoning laws. It could be our theology. It could be the way we do, ecclesiology, the way we build the church, the structures of the church. It could be, secular institutions. It could be all those things can have examples of racism. So an example in church in ecclesiology would be, if somebody says, okay, black people aren't allowed to take communion alongside white people, or they can't be members of our church. Those things existed in history for, at different points and among different Christians. And that would be an example, I think, of an institutionalized racism. Okay. So here's my question then that we're going to look at a little bit more. So if racism is both a learned behavior and institutionalized, in other words, we can teach people how to be racist. That's not precluding, like somebody said, there's a theological discussion of maybe if we have sin that we're born into, and that would be a good discussion. But let's just go with the fact that we can learn it. We can watch people around us. We could watch how, maybe people treat somebody who's different. And then we say, well, we emulate that behavior. We model ourselves after that behavior. So it could be learned and it could be institutionalized. Then we have to answer this next question, which is how? How is it learned and how does it become institutionalized? Because it's not enough to acknowledge that it simply exists, right? So here's what I would say is, if you have a world, we all have a worldview. We all have a way of trying to look at the world around and give a coherent answer about what makes sense of life, what makes sense of the world around me. It's our origin, meaning, purpose, and our destiny. Those are the four areas of a worldview. And we're saying, okay, where did I come from? What's my purpose in life? What gives me meaning? And where am I headed? What's my future? What's my destiny? And a worldview really answers those things. But it gives us this idea of related to race, where a worldview could logically exclude racism. So I could have a view of the world that says racism is evil and bad, and it's not a part of my system. And it's consistent with my worldview. I'm not just claiming that, but I have a reason for it. I have a foundation for excluding racism in my worldview. Another option, a worldview, might provide a logically coherent foundation that permits racism. So there are some worldviews. So you say if you're a white supremacist, right? We're just picking the easy stuff. If you're Hitler, right? You have a worldview that's within your worldview. It's completely consistent. It's a coherent foundation. It makes sense. It's actually logically allowed. That it may, people of reasonable people conclude that racism is good because it fits with their worldview. Okay. And then the third option is you could have a worldview that is logically coherent foundation that entails racism. So, so in this, the difference is this worldview, everybody who holds that particular worldview would have to embrace racism because that's the only thing it allows for. So the distinction between number 2 and number 3 is that, if something's logically coherent, they say, well, I might discriminate based on race, but somebody says, well, I don't discriminate based on race. I discriminate based on, maybe somebody has a disability, or maybe there's some other issue where maybe that worldview allows for some sort of discrimination, but not necessarily racism. In the third one, racism is sort of like, yes, that's the most. And this example would be sort of definitely the sort of Nazi example for sure, because that was completely not only coherent, it entailed it. If you were a Nazi, you not only needed to, you not only could you be a racist, you had to be, because that worldview said this is the way it must be for all of us, right? So does that make sense? Those three options kind of make sense to you guys? Anybody? If not, just throw up your hand. I won't pause because I know it's with the delay. It might take a second, but throw up any questions if that's not, clear to you, or if you have a question about that, and I can address that. Okay. So if you do, just Nick or I think Melissa's back in. So either one of you just interrupt, and that's fine.
You want people to ask questions during, or do you just want to stop and kind of get thoughts and that kind of thing, or?
Yeah, like at that point, like yeah, if somebody has a question that's relevant to that, or if they're lost in that, I definitely want to make sure everyone's following along with that. So definitely, jump in if the question's really relevant to those slides. If there are other questions, it's broader questions, I'll probably get to those a little bit later or maybe at the end. But if there are questions specifically like they're about, those worldview options, I definitely want to take those right now. Does that make sense? Okay. So, yeah, if there's questions pertaining to any slide going on, yeah, sure, jump in at any point. Anybody can jump in at any point. That's fine with me. But because I can't see your chats, I'm relying on Nick or Melissa. You guys got to let me know. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So here's the argument I want to make then. Okay. And here's the essence of the argument that I want to put forth to you guys tonight. So it's true, and we have to be careful here, that people have twisted both science and creation theories to justify and institutionalize racism. So my argument tonight is not that when I'm arguing against this Darwinian worldview that I'll kind of explain a little bit, it's not that that created racism or institutionalized racism. My argument is not that it didn't exist before that, because anybody can use anything to justify. People can pick out a verse out of the Bible and say, yes, this justifies why I hate XYZ person, whoever that might be. But that's possible. The real question is, as I said, racism existed before those things. The question is it not just permitted, but is it logically consistent? And so for Darwinism, my point would be that I think it's possible we could make the argument that racism is entailed by Darwinism. In other words, you may not be able to escape that from a purely naturalistic material worldview. I think that's a little harder case to make. But what I'll definitely say is that Darwinian theory permits racism. So there's nothing logically inconsistent holding to a naturalist worldview and human evolution that does not like say that's wrong. Okay. And I'll kind of back that up a little bit later on. But in contrast to that, The Christian worldview, grounded in this idea of biblical creation, historical Adam and Eve, logically excludes racism and entails racial reconciliation. I think both those sides are important. So the idea here is that, yes, there are people who believe in creation, again, who might be racist, but I think that view would be inconsistent with their worldview. They're defying their biblical foundation to embrace their racist thinking. So I believe that it's a truly biblical creationist worldview excludes racism, and also on a negative side, but also on a positive side says, yes, even more than opposing racism, I have to stand for something positive, which is racial reconciliation. And that those two sides, I think, are very important for understanding what it means to have a vibrant Christian worldview. So let me do this then. Let me define what is biblical creation for you guys. So I'm not going to go take a whole lot of time on each of these points. I'm just going to assume you guys can follow along. And if we have questions later or at any point, like I said, you can just jump in. But here's my foundation for what I believe. And I won't take a lot of time explaining it. I'm just telling you where I'm coming from. Okay. So Genesis 1 and 2 is God's revelation. It's something that we got from God, breaking into our reality, breaking into our lives. And he gave a revelation to, I believe, Moses. And Moses wrote down this revelation of the origins of human life and where we came from. That's recorded in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 is historical narrative. It's distinct from other ancient Near East literature and has central qualities, similar only in its accidental qualities. So here's some philosophical terms that you guys may not be familiar with, but what this really means is that there's a lot of other ancient myths about how humans came to exist, right? But in terms of its most fundamental qualities of what makes Genesis 1 and 2 unique, there are no essential similarities between what Genesis 1 and 2 records and other ancient Near East mythologies. Now, there are similarities in what philosophy we call accidental qualities that are non-essential to the story. So in other words, some stories talk about water being there at the formation. Some talk about, like there's Egyptian mythologies, the god Ptah, who has a tongue and he spoke things into existence. So the idea of speaking into existence there, but it doesn't mean the same thing as even Genesis 1 would when it says in the beginning was the Word was with God, God spoke and then it came to be. They meant two different things by that. So it uses the word spoke and it talks about tongues and speaking, but they meant very different things. So Genesis 1 and 2 really does stand unique against all these other ancient Near East mythologies. I would say that Genesis 1 and 2 reveals a historically accurate account of human origins, though through God's special creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And a corollary to that, Genesis 1 and 2, it has a divine purpose, not a scientific. It gives us God's divine purpose, not a scientific process. So I believe that Genesis 1 and 2 gives us a historically accurate account of where humans came from the hand of God, that God created us, male and female. And he put us in this garden. I believe that was a historical event and it happened in time. But I don't believe it tells us the scientific process of how God did it. So God could have used natural things or processes. I have no problem with that because Genesis is not trying to give us that process. It's just saying God spoke and he is ultimately the author of our existence. So those are my main premises going forward on what biblical creation is all about. Okay. So this doctrine of creation, though, as it's played out in the New Testament, is also familiar. And like I said, I'm going now into explaining how biblical creation is used in the New Testament for our Christian doctrine, as a foundation for our many beliefs. So Jesus taught that Adam and Eve were the blueprint for marriage covenant. So when we talk about the idea of male and female, man and woman, Jesus taught explicitly. He pointed back to Adam and Eve and God and God's creation as the source, as the blueprint for what marriage is. Paul taught that Jesus was the second Adam who saved humanity from the first Adam's fall. So, Paul tied the idea of the original fall, Genesis 3, and Adam's creation Eve as well in that sense, and that both, were Adam, both were human, but both tie that idea of the fall to Jesus being the second Adam. So there's a pretty critical piece of our Christian doctrine that's tied to that. The hope of eternal resurrection is tied to God's creation of Adam and Eve as unique form, as unique from all creation. So 1 Corinthians basically talks about our hope of being resurrected, the end when Christ comes, and this ties this idea of a future resurrection with this idea of biblical creation. And then through the second Adam, that is Jesus, humanity can be freed from the tyranny of racial animus that mars our culture. So when we talk about racialized views of humanity, whether it's black, white, Hispanic, Asian, all of these sort of things, Galatians tells us that Jesus broke down those dividing walls that are built up by culture, that are built up by sin, that are built up by institutions that would divide us. And so Jesus being the second Adam is what frees us from that. So if we talk about Galatians, this idea of Jesus breaking down the barriers, we have to understand the context for that is God created. And so this idea of you can see it in the words behind me, this from Genesis 1:27, the Hebrew is B'Tselem Elohim. It means in the image of God. And so the argument in Galatians and throughout the New Testament is if we're all made in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim, then we have to recognize that Christ's work on the cross restores that the fullness of that sacredness and puts us on a path to healing all of the brokenness that comes from the fall. Okay, so those are the main things. I want to get any questions on that before I get into this next slide, though. Do you guys have any thoughts, or I don't want to lose anybody at that point, whether it's the historic teaching on biblical creation or how that plays out in Christian doctrine. Any thoughts from you guys? Okay.
Everybody's quiet tonight.
I know. I will take that as just an awesomeness of my presentation, and
you made it so clear. We have absolutely no questions.
It's so clear. There could not be possibly any questions. So, all right. Well, if you guys do, just jump in and post them up, and I'll pause.
Yeah, if you feel more comfortable putting the questions in the chat too, that's fine as well. So.
Yeah, for sure. Any way you guys do it. So here's the way this plays out. So when we look at this doctrine of creation and the doctrines of the scripture, that especially Galatians and 1 Corinthians, we can see how this plays out and has an impact on the way we build our society, or the way that society is shaped. So we can look back to Martin Luther King Jr. And he's great when he gave this speech, this now of course famous speech, talking about "Let Freedom Ring," from 1963. He has this line. He says, "I have a dream that I have a dream speech," and then "Let Freedom Ring." Sorry, another one. But I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now he's quoting the Declaration of Independence, but the Declaration of Independence was drawing upon this idea of biblical creation, that we are created by God as equal, as inherently of the same value, of the same worth, that all of our lives have equal sacredness because we are made B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. There we are. So the part of this speech, it's very, if you haven't listened to him, he has a great intonation, and King was a great orator. So I won't pretend to be on his level at that. But there's this great passage. He says this: "Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountain, let freedom ring." And he goes on to this passage and this repeats this "let freedom ring." But this highlighted part is what I want you to focus on. It says, "All of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." And so he wanted this idea of freedom will ring, that we can come together all of these ways, these conventions of breaking us down, really reminiscent of Galileo, which we talked about earlier, said we will be able to say that we are free from oppression when we acknowledge that through Christ's work, we have been, set free from having to be slaves to these oppressive cultural or institutional forms of racism. And that was his dream, which was tied clearly for him as a Baptist minister to not only creation, but to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So here we are, the argument restated. Let me just a very simple, couple sentence summary of my argument. So the biblical revelation of historical Adam and Eve, created as sacred beings in God's image as the designed progenitors of all mankind, that is, they are the biological forerunners of every living human being. There are no human beings who came into existence that cannot trace their lineage back to Adam and Eve. That's what I'm arguing here. This provides the most coherent ethical foundation for knowing racial bigotry is objectively evil, and the biological justification for rejecting the socio-political dehumanization. So I think this idea of theology of creation, but the science of knowing that we have this Adam and Eve as our biological ancestors, combined really give us this really solid, coherent argument that is against, that opposes racism, opposes any form of dehumanization, but ultimately compels us to fight for racial reconciliation. And so that's the simple basis of the argument. All right, so I want to go and back that up a little bit for you guys. Again, if you have questions, jump in at any point, because now we're going to transition to this part where I'm going to get into some of the history, some of the studies that I've looked at that are, I think, helpful for understanding this. And what I want to do is frame that in a way that I think hopefully will be compelling for you, that you'll understand where we're going, but also agree with me at the end of this, I hope. So there's two ideas. There's biblical creation and these sort of modern historical alternatives, not scientific. So what I want you guys to understand is that when I'm talking about this Darwinian worldview, which I believe, at least allows for racism to take place. It doesn't exclude it as a possibility. This is not a knock on science itself. It's not a scientific worldview. Darwin had a very much a philosophical approach to how he viewed the world, and that certainly informed his science. But the science itself is not a worldview, but the Darwinian way of framing the scientific evidence was a worldview, and that worldview, I think, is ultimately very destructive for race relations. So I'll quote from this guy named Mortimer Adler. I don't know if you guys ever know. I like to use his quote because I think Adler's a brilliant dude. If you're not familiar with Adler, he was an atheist philosopher. He's the guy who all the volumes of the great books of the Western world. I don't know if you guys even know what those are, read those in college anymore or whatever. I mean, I didn't read them in college either as an engineering student, but I know there's whole studies built around these things. But it has all the greatest sort of literature, from poetry to science to whatever that the West has kind of put together. But he compiled all this stuff. So he was well-read. He later in his life became a Christian, but he was an atheist philosopher at this point when he's writing this particular quote. In the 1930s, as it says here, he was an atheist philosopher. He observed evolution, quote, "Evolution is not a scientific fact, but at best a probable history, a history for which the evidence is insufficient and conflicting." So here we have this atheist philosopher, I think one of the most brilliant guys that I've read, just in terms of his thinking and what he understood about literature and where he read. He's recognizing that this idea of evolution, what he's calling evolution, but I would say is this Darwinian worldview is really that. It's not a competing. There's not Christianity, or it's not these things competing with science. It's not even evolution competing with science in what he's framing here. It's offering a different history of where did we come from. Remember that idea of worldview. It's origin, meaning, purpose, and destiny. And so evolution, he's saying, gives us an alternative view of that origin, meaning, purpose, and destiny as it comes out. And he's saying there's the science of that theory doesn't fall together for him. So what did he mean by that? Well, I'm going to give you a very quick history lesson here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I want you to know that in the 17th century, there's a guy named Bishop John Wilkins. He was an Oxford scientist, founding member of the British Royal Society, which, if you in sciencey worlds, you know what that is, right? But for Wilkins, he was a Christian, he was a creationist, and he believed essentially that there's a sort of limited common descent, that all the animals that existed could have evolved from what was left on Noah's Ark, that all of us by extension could have evolved despite all of our differences. Remember, we talked about those phenotypical differences, the external characteristics of skin color, or, in case of animals, fur, or, all those things, that through this change over time, through this quote unquote evolutionary process, this biological change over time, that we can see all this diversity around us, but it didn't have to come from a single common ancestor. We could have had this happen. That was his theory, okay, that he had. Well, that kind of got changed over time. And, whoops, I'm not missing my slide. And then there's a guy named Lyell. He's a Scottish deist, in other words, he believed that there was a creator God, but sort of God set it on the motion and then sort of washed his hands of the world, right? And then set everything going. So Charles Lyell, he advanced a different theory than we get from a guy like Wilkins. And he said there's this uniformitarian old earth, and the species were fixed within their realms. They couldn't get out of their where they were created by, or where sort of they came into being. God sort of set it all in motion, but they were fixed. They couldn't leave there was no biological change over time in these species. And that's what Lyell's model was. So Darwin comes along, but he had this sort of a God-free world idea. He didn't like the idea that these theistic models that had come before. So in the 19th century, he sort of say, okay, I like Lyell's uniformitarian old earth idea and the denial of any kind of supernatural intervention, but especially because he denied there was a God. But similar to Wilkins, he said, okay, I want to advance the view of evolution. Quote, I'm kind of using that little air quotes there. This idea of change, biological change over time through gradual changes over long ages. So he sort of picked from Lyell's worldview, he picked from Wilkins' worldview and their scientific endeavors, and he kind of crafted this new theory that put together pieces that a lot of other people had talked about before, but it was new in the sense of how he was kind of putting a lot of these pieces together. Okay. So what this gave us was really 4 competing histories of racial origins. And this is where, again, I'm going to throw out some names. Not that I expect you guys to know all these or remember these. They're really not completely relevant to everything I want to do on, but I like to put the names on the slide. So if you guys want to take little notes, or if you want to look up some of these names after, it gives you something you can kind of use for further study if there's something that piques your curiosity. So here are these 4 competing histories based on Darwin's worldview. So the first option is what we'll call theistic polygenism. So, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. And that's like a theistic, meaning God's in the picture, and then some sort of evolutionary process where people have different, or the races started from different ancestral pools of people. Okay, and there's a guy named Louis Agassiz that advanced this idea. Then there was atheistic polygenism. So there's a guy named Carlton Kuhn in the 20th century who's a good example of this sort of thinking. So what does it mean when we're talking this idea of polygenism? So whether they were a theist and they put God in the mix, or whether they were an atheist, didn't matter. They had some common ground. So the common ground for the polygenist was that the assumption that all human races originate from distinct sets of ancestors. So the black races had one set of ancestors, white races had another. And most of these had between 5 or 6, usually some had 8 racial groups. There was the Mongols were considered one race, which were sort of the Asian, or what they would actually in their literature call the yellow races. Then they had the what they call in the literature the Negro races, the African races, and those would be black, the black races. Then the European, the Caucasoid races would be the white races. And then they had different the Indians, which we'd call ancestors that could be connected biologically with these these sort of races of human beings, but they all had these separate lines of evolution, separate lines for that got them to their current racial category of evolution. So this is sort of a typical thing you'd see back in the day for arguments. Now, the other two categories are atheistic monogenism. So now notice instead of polygenism, we're going to have monogenism. So there's atheistic forms where guys like William King, and there's theistic monogenism. Like this is a Catholic priest. His name was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So you have atheists and theists alike who have this idea of monogenistic ancestry. So the common ground for this monogenist was the assumption that all human races originated from a common ancestral group. So there you go. There's the distinction between the polygenists and the monogenists. Polygenists, many different ancestral different ancestral groups. The monogenist said, oh no, we all come from some ancestral group, right? We all sort of a universal common descendant, or ancestor that we all descend from. Guys like King and Teilhard graded humans then lower or higher by degree of evolved perfection. So instead of like the polygenists who said people are lower or higher based on their biological ancestry of which group they came from, the monogenists said, hey, you're higher or lower based on sort of where you are on the evolutionary scale. So this is why you get a lot of history, and we'll see some pictures later of, where blacks were typically treated as the closest to the apes and the source of the missing link. So we could find this missing link between human and ape when we look to black people. That was the idea of where we could find it, because they were lower on the scale of evolution for how the monogenists looked at that. So a guy like Teilhard, he said eugenics, that's a means of sort of a process where society is trying to cooperate with science, or science is trying to cooperate with what we observe in nature. So if nature is evolving us to higher forms, then our science should help us by helping pick the winners and losers so that we can make sure that we have a more purified race, a more purified human race. He says, so eugenics is a great means to this end. Since the perfection of the universe coincides with the coming of individual souls to a higher and distinct center of personality, the evils resulting, which have produced the moral crisis of progress, are swept aside for the sake of spiritual and biological evolution. So what he's saying is that, look, yes, there are evils with humans that suffer, that are in poverty, that often happen because, for example, governments help poor people survive when they couldn't normally survive on their own. And this leads to a lot of suffering and crisis. So we need to stop helping the unfit, the inferior, survive, because we're hindering the progress of evolution. And so, and yes, this might entail potentially we take active forms, say like sterilizing mentally ill people, or sterilizing poor people, or in some cases maybe even black people. I'm not saying he argued that specifically, but there are many who did argue that. But they said, hey, that's just, if some may view that as evil, but if we look at this in terms of the end goal of human progress, then that evil is swept aside. We no longer have to worry about that, because our goal is to advance humanity. And this is what, again, a Christian Roman Catholic theologian argued. So where did he get this idea, though? I think it really does come from Darwin himself. And Darwin, he in his writings, he dealt with these sort of things. So Darwin did not believe blacks were necessarily a unique species. So this is important about Darwin, but did use the term. He did use the term subspecies and mongrel population to describe crossbreeding between blacks and white Europeans. So when they did interbreed, he thought that these were sort of mongrel, populations, that they were less fit, essentially. They weren't as higher. They were reflecting a lower biological formulation of evolution, in a sense. So in his Descent of Man, he really has this really fascinating passage. He tells his readers, quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man," which he meant Caucasian races, "will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races," which he meant the Negro races, throughout the world. So he knew that basically evolution was on the side of the Caucasian races, and that at some point, in a very near future, all these Negro races would be extinct by this natural process of evolution. So Darwin was, in a large part, opposed to, doing active things to harm black people. He was opposed to slavery. He didn't like it, but he also recognized that nature was going to take its course, and the superior races would survive. You see this in a guy like King, who looked at Neanderthals